Morning.
Morning, how are you? All right, guys, well, we will go ahead and get started. Y'all know me, but I'm Ashley Connor with O'Kelly. It's right across the hall from y'all's office. Today, what I wanted to go over was how to write the best offer. I see a lot of not so hot offers come through, and I hear a lot of questions trying to be a little bit creative, but maybe putting your client at risk when you're getting creative. So again, I wanted to go over great ways to do that and still make sure that you're protecting your buyers when you're writing these offers. I've got my contact info. As always, I want to make sure y'all have my cell phone. If you need me, feel free to text me, call me. You can always email me, walk over and visit as well. Just want to make sure that I'm easily accessible to everybody. So kind of what we're going to go over today, what's on our agenda, if you will, is the structure of your offer, the different contingencies, the actual terms in the contract that are going to be the most attractive to a seller, the different stipulations that you can put into your contract to really kind of make it pack a punch, and then backup offers, how those are also a really great tool for you guys. So as far as the actual structure goes, kind of breaking that down a little bit, we'll talk about our love letters, the organization of the offer, creating a positive experience for everyone involved, and then using your lender as leverage. That is super, super important. So love letters, y'all have heard me talk about this. And what I always like to say is if you have questions, comments, thoughts, definitely interrupt me. I want it to be as interactive and helpful for y'all as possible. So as far as love letters go, what are our thoughts on this? Y'all know what I mean by love letters?
Basically, between my wife and I.
That's good. A good way to treat them. I support that.
I think it's a good idea. In this market, that letter, like, which you will come, always, but, okay.
So I think love letters are a bit of a conundrum. Because from the buyer's perspective, I totally see how that could be the thought, and you want to sort of convince the seller that you're the right person to, you know, own and live in this home that they've loved. I totally see that. However, from the listing agent perspective, you want to stay away from this as much as possible. And here's why. What happens when it's a really hot market is there's a bunch of offers coming in, right? When there's multiple offers on a lot of properties, that means that most buyers are going to be turned down with their offer for a couple homes before they actually find one where their offer gets accepted. So you have a lot of disgruntled buyers, if you will. And so what happens is, let's say you've got two buyers that each write a love letter on the same house. One buyer you've got is maybe a single man. The other buyer is a family. The buyer with the family includes a photo. Single man maybe includes a photo of him and his dog, whatever. The seller chooses the family. Well, the single man brings a lawsuit saying you didn't choose me because you wanted a family. You discriminated against me based off of my familial status, which I know sounds so ridiculous that someone would bring that lawsuit, but it was happening all the time. So as a seller and a listing agent, you want to not have those love letters. As an agent for a buyer, I think you need to be really careful about adding those in. You need to make sure that you read the comments on the listing to see if the listing agent has said, we don't accept love letters. Because not paying attention to what those requirements are is not going to bode well for you. So if you're going to do it, be really, really careful. Don't set yourself up for any sort of discrimination kind of complaint. Really, that's going to be relevant on the listing side, but you want to create a good reputation for yourself. You don't want to put another agent in a bad position. So be careful with those. There is a way to write a love letter that doesn't set anybody up for discrimination. And so what that looks like is really just writing about the house. You don't talk about the buyer at all. Not, I can see my new baby being so cute in that nursery room. You know, that all of a sudden you said what your familial status is, right? I love the sunroom. I can't wait to sit out there and enjoy nature, whatever. Like that doesn't have anything about anybody's national origin, their race, their familial status, their gender, their orientation, none of that. It just talks about the house itself. If you're writing that kind of letter, no discrimination issue. But once you start talking, when the buyer starts talking about themselves or what they might do in the house, that can open the door to a discrimination issue. So can you write a decent love letter that doesn't get anyone in trouble? Yes. Is that easy to do? No, almost all of them are gonna say something, even like, I can't wait to walk my dog on the nature trails behind your house. Well, is that discriminating against somebody with a handicap because they can't walk, you know, stuff like that. Again, it sounds really silly.
That is completely unacceptable. I know as a society we have it,
Yeah,
but seriously,
I agree, but
we're catering to. Don't talk about one.
I understand where you're coming from. I'm not gonna tell you I disagree with you.
We won't.
But there are people that will bring a lawsuit over it. And so what you wanna do is not get in the middle of the lawsuit, which ridiculous as it may be, still a thing that happens.
How, when you say avoid them as a listing agent, what do you mean? Like putting in the listing, I'd love to see a love letter? Or what?
No, in what you wanna do, and the way to avoid that is in your seller brokerage agreement. You put as a stipulation that the seller does not want to see any love letters. So what that authorizes you to do is when you receive an offer from the other agent with a love letter, you say, my seller's not accepting love letters, send it back without the love letter. Because what your brokerage agreement says that you have to pass on any offer that you receive, you have to present that offer, right?
Right.
So you can't just unilaterally decide you're not gonna present this offer because it has a love letter. But to protect you and your seller, you want that in the brokerage agreement, that seller's not accepting any love letters. You wanna put that in like the private remarks for your listing, that no love letters should be submitted with the offer. So then when an agent does send an offer that has a love letter, you're authorized by your seller and you've given them a heads up that you're not gonna pass on that offer. So you just say, hey, send about the love letter.
And you suggest that's the way to go?
Yeah, if you're on the listing side, 100%, because you don't wanna get in the middle of a lawsuit. You just don't, and there are people that will bring the lawsuit, and even if the lawsuit gets thrown out, because it's ridiculous, you still had to spend all the time and energy and money dealing with it.
How would the other buyer know that the seller accepted it because of the more money? Or even people?
There's no way they know, but if, passing conversation, they might know, maybe they're a little off the rocker and they decide to drive by the house and look at the new buyer, and they see that the new buyer is a different race than they are. They can say, well, you only accepted them because X, Y, Z. Agents talk about offers that are accepted or not accepted, not really knowing that they're divulging information. Like if you were to call and say, hey, did you get a love letter on the offer you accepted? An agent might say, yeah, it was so cute. And now all of a sudden, so is there any sort of like official record of them? No, of course not, but there's ways to find out. So if it happens, I recommend not taking them as a listing agent. As a buyer's agent, I think you're setting up the other side for a possible issue, but you can do it. And, Tim, to your point, it certainly can tip a seller over the edge, but legally that's not what's supposed to make the seller decide. Seller's not supposed to discriminate either positively or negatively for anything. They're just supposed to pick the best offer. Now, a seller can have met someone and not say, I'm picking the offer because I love this, and I would be super careful about putting anything in writing about that. But nobody can really force a seller to pick one offer or another for any reason, and they don't have to say why they picked. So, I mean, technically, you could pick someone with a family. If you find that out, you just can't tell anybody. Or whatever sort of requirements you're looking for. It really, why I say to avoid this is it opens the door for problems moving forward that you just really don't have time to deal with. It's kind of the gist of that, the main point there. Again, you can write an okay one, it's just very, very difficult. And I think it's very difficult to explain to your buyer how to write a good one, and it's gonna take so much more energy for you and your buyer to get an acceptable letter than to just not do it.
So we sold our house September 2021. an offer came in with a love letter, and it probably broke every rule. That
Most
you,
of them will.
that you mentioned here.
Mhm.
Now, the offer also wasn't the best offer on the table, but, it was nice to see what somebody was going to do with the house in the future. It was nice
Well, that's what makes
to
it
say that.
so hard, is that sellers like to feel like they get to know the person that's gonna live in their home, especially if they lived there, right? If it's an investor, they might not care, but someone who lived there, it's really nice for a seller to feel like they're getting to pass on their home to like a good quality, whoever, that's gonna take care of the house, and like you said, know what they're gonna do with the house and their intent with it. And it makes the buyer feel good to kind of tell their story and convince someone to accept it. And that's why it's such a hard topic to kind of avoid or to explain why it doesn't make sense, because both the buyer and the seller really want them. But they're not thinking of what the consequences are a little bit later on down the road.
True, yeah, I mean, for us, it was nice to see that the people that wanted to buy the house really wanted it for the same reasons that we wanted it for when we were ready to buy it.
Mhm.
So, but, you know, it obviously is
The-
easy fodder for
I've never experienced.
lawyers.
And they were here from California, and snipped it off, putting it in there, okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, and
Yeah,
there are benefits to them, but there's also consequences. And to me, the consequence from the listing side is really gonna outweigh the benefit and framing that, because your seller is not even gonna be thinking about what, you know, they might get sued for, because to your point, most of it's kind of silly, right? Like a seller should be able to sell who they want to sell to, period, end of story, somebody else's business, which really is true. However, you're not allowed to discriminate, and so people bring up these complaints, so it's one of those just not worth it. I think if you have a buyer that absolutely insists on it, I'm not saying like die on that hill, but just something to think about and be careful, and I'm a little bit more concerned from the listing side.
you can get AI, right? So stimulation. And do it perfect like.
I suppose if you input the stipulations correctly,
Right.
there's a little bit of human error on that front, so I don't know. Maybe. A little thing that really is gonna make a huge difference is the actual organization of the offer. So first and foremost, give them one PDF or one, like if it's on DocuSign, whatever, you know, I'm not super tech savvy, but one document, right? Don't piecemeal it, right? Make it nice and organized. Put it in order. So you want to have the counter offer first, then the purchase and sale, and then your exhibit, and have exhibit A, and then B, and then C, so they can see that they're all there, right? It is frustrating, I think, for a listing agent when you've got 10 offers coming in and half of them are formatted like exhibit B, exhibit F, counter offer, and then exhibit A, C, B. They're like, whoa, that is way out of order. Then they have to do all the work to put it in order. And what that says to them is that you as an agent are not organized. So how easy is that transaction gonna go? If you make it easy for them from the beginning, they can clearly see in order what your offer looks like. You're already gonna have a little bit of a leg up on the people who are not doing that. So little things like that make a huge difference. Because if you think about working with the other side, do you want someone who's organized and has their ducks in a row, or you want someone who's scatterbrained and is gonna forget things? You want the organized person. So don't set your client up for failure by being disorganized yourself. A reminder of important dates, kind of in the same vein, having just like almost a synopsis of your offer, I think is really, really helpful for listing agents when there's a bunch of them. They can kind of see the major points of the offer, and then they can like scroll through to see everything that you actually have, but to kind of hit the high notes makes their job easier. And if you're making the listing agent's job easier, they're going to like you more, which might be helpful. Oh, there's my chat box. Might be helpful for selecting offers. Oh, there's ilovepdf.com to merge and split. Things out of my tech understanding realm, but that sounds great. be punctual. If there is in the private remarks a deadline, like, we're accepting offers up through Monday at 5 p.m. Unless you don't even see the property until after Monday at 5 p.m., get your offer in by 5 p.m. on Monday, so that you've shown them that you've read and paid attention, you're detail oriented, you respect their time. And so that'll be helpful as well. I know those are little things, but they really do make a difference.
Consider everything in order, reminder of important dates. That's just
So
what is that,
put
like,
everything-
talking about like a separate page that's just like
Yeah,
offer
or
date, this is like the.
it can be like, so GAR has a form for that. You can also just put it in the email. And I think, I've seen the form used when you have a binding contract. I don't know that I would use that form sending in an offer, but just like, hey Sally, my client really loved the house. We're excited to present this offer to your sellers. Here are the main points that my client is offering. Please see attached offer. And it's like purchase price, seller credit, due diligence period, loan contingency period, appraisal contingency, sort of like, what they're looking at, which pages they're flipping past, where their eyes are gonna go. Give them a quick synopsis of that. Now make sure you do it correctly. If you, don't forget, if you have 15 days due diligence, don't accidentally miss hitting the 5 and say 1 day, and then there's 15, because then you look like a liar and you're totally not gonna get accepted. So be careful with that. But I think it's a helpful tool. If you think of it from the listing agent perspective, if you can comb through 30 pages of an offer to figure it out, or if you can see it all in one little snippet, that's really, really helpful when you have 10 offers. You still have to look through them, but at least you know what you're looking at.
Right.
And that's just something to make the listing agent's life easier, which is gonna bode well for you and your client. What I mean by creating a positive experience is really just how you treat the other agent. So reputation is a huge deal when you're in multiple offers, and this is important from the selling side and the buying side. But you don't want to be the person who is such a jerk that when there's 10 offers, that agent is gonna say, oh no, I've worked with Ashley before, she was horrible, we're automatically putting that offer in the trash. So, markets fluctuate, and at some point, listing agents are really gonna need a buyer, and they're gonna have to be the ones who are next. Right now, the sellers have the control, so make sure that you're giving a good impression to everyone that you work with. And when you're sending in the offer, you're not, like berating them for not taking it. You're not following up every 30 seconds, saying, have they decided, have they decided? There's appropriate follow-ups, but then there's being annoying. So just keep that in mind, and you want to represent your client to the best of your ability, but you also want to make sure that you're keeping your reputation intact. And to the last point, when there's a bunch of offers, if there's only 2 offers, your reputation's probably not gonna play a huge deal in which offer they select, right? Unless it's so bad that they just refuse to work with you kind of thing. But for the most part, there's only a couple offers, that's not gonna be as big of an issue. But if you have 30 offers on one property, there's gonna be a lot of offers that are virtually identical, right? And if the only distinguishing factor between 3 offers is, I've never worked with this agent, I've worked with this agent and loved them, I've worked with this agent and couldn't stand them. Well, they couldn't stand one, that's for sure getting dropped. And then they're gonna push hard for the agent they liked working with. So that can be the deciding factor in your client getting the house and not getting the house, is the reputation that you have. So don't be the reason your client doesn't get the house. And then lastly, as far as the structure goes, kind of setting it up, using your lender as leverage is a huge benefit. So if you have a buyer with a loan, obviously if it's a cash transaction, that's not gonna be real helpful. But the simple act of having the lender call the listing agent makes a huge difference. And to me, I've heard a lot of times where the lender does make that phone call, they beat out a cash offer. Because if you think about it, having a buyer where a lender is vouching for them, so it's this other party saying, hey, this guy is good to go, that adds a ton of validity to the transaction, right? You know that it's gonna close, because this lender not only is vouching for them, but also they're showing that they're open to communicate. And so that's a really important thing as a listing agent, to have that open line of communication with the lender. That means they're gonna keep you up to date on the transaction, means if you have questions, they're gonna be available to answer if they're taking the time to call you from the get-go. And sometimes a cash buyer, you get proof of funds, but sometimes that can be forged, and we all love a cash buyer, but a vouch for loan buyer is often even stronger than a cash buyer. So when you're working with a buyer, first off, try to get them to use a lender that you know and trust. So you have that relationship to ask them to make the call. And even if you don't, I would still ask them to reach out. So that way, and it stands out too, right? Because if you have a bunch of offers and then you've got one lender calling, that listing agent is gonna remember the lender that called. And that's gonna be kind of at the forefront of their mind. Again, it's gonna be helpful in getting the offer accepted. Questions on the structure? Okay. So our next section there are the different contingencies that you can put in your contract that are gonna be helpful. I wanna talk a little bit about due diligence versus the right to request repairs, which is kind of a tongue twister for me. The conventional loan contingency and then the no financing contingency. It's hard, say it 3 times.
So,
fast.
right, request repair, I'd say,
It's a lot.
it's a lot.
It's a lot. So, and it kind of covered up, let me see if I can move this. Or. Okay, so what due diligence is in the contract, it's an option contract. You're essentially getting a free look at the property, which means a buyer can terminate the contract for any reason whatsoever. They don't even have to give a reason, right? So that's great for your buyers. They can ask for anything to be done. Seller doesn't have to agree to any of it. Once the due diligence period has passed, the property is being sold as is. What does as is mean?
No changes.
Without any.
Does that mean the seller has no obligation to disclose anything?
I do have.
We have the obligation to disclose any defects.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so whenever I talk about as is, I like to make sure that people understand, just because the seller is saying property is being sold as is, just because due diligence has come and gone and the property is really being sold as is, that does not wipe away the seller obligation to disclose those latent defects. And if they've made any other disclosures, those still have to be honest disclosures. So make sure that your sellers understand that. But as far as the buyer goes.
Okay, I got a question.
Okay.
So let's say you didn't do the latent, you did the solar disclosure, right? And on the solar disclosure, you put on there that the roof was 8 years old, right? And then the buyer comes in, does inspection, and the roof's actually 20 years old. And you're outside your due diligence period. Can the buyer stop the transaction and get their earnest money back?
So the disclosure, it doesn't have to be filled out accurately, it has to be filled out honestly. So the question is, did the seller know how old the roof was? So did they lie? Or did they really think it was 8 years old? And that makes a difference. If they lied, then that's not allowed.
Right.
If they didn't lie, it's a harder case. Because they really, again, it's gotta be honest, not accurate. So that's kind of the crux of it.
Right.
But if they lied, then yes, I think the buyer would be able to terminate. If they didn't lie, I don't know that they would.
Right, how would you know?
You would have to prove that they knew. So the onus sits with the buyer to prove that the seller lied. But if you're doing your inspection, the goal is to do that in the due diligence period, and that's what the due diligence period is for.
Right.
So that would be surprising to me that an inspection would come in after the due diligence period.
Right.
But, obviously it did in this example. So I think you would have to, it's difficult to figure out that they've lied, which is kind of the problem with the whole thing.
Right.
If they had some sort of, roof inspection that said your roof is 17 years old from 3 years ago, and you got a hold of that inspection, because sometimes what happens is the same company will come out, and they're like, no, we were out here 2 years ago per our records, and we put the age of the roof in that report. Well, then all of a sudden, the seller had the report, you knew it was dishonest disclosure, then you're good. Without that, I think it's very difficult to prove that. For the right to request repairs, this is a separate exhibit. This is not what part of the contract. It used to be in lieu of due diligence, but then the contract was updated years and years ago to include due diligence instead, because it really is a lot more clear cut, a lot cleaner for both sides. But what the right to request repairs is buyer really can only terminate, and honestly, the contract terminates automatically if there are defects that the buyer timely asks the seller to correct, and they can't come to an agreement on what's gonna be corrected, then the contract automatically will terminate if it's not decided in that time frame, in that window set out in the exhibit. The only thing a buyer can ask the seller to do is correct a defect. Now, the form defines a defect, and the form does just about as good of a job as they could defining a defect, but people still have a really hard time applying that rule. People think defect and they think something's not great with the property. That's not always the case. If there's an issue, but it was like grandfathered in because it occurred a long time ago, like how far your hot water heater has to sit above the floor, stuff like that. There's certain requirements, different ordinances for that, but if you're grandfathered in, it's not really a defect, whereas the inspection report can say, hey, this is a problem. The buyers misunderstand what a defect actually is. Sellers misunderstand what a defect actually is. So there's a lot of issues that come up with that, but that's all the buyer can technically ask for. Once that defect resolution period is over, just like once due diligence is over, the property is sold as is. So a lot of people say right to request repairs. That's a lot more narrow than due diligence. As a seller, I would really rather see that. But that's not a good idea. I would really encourage y'all to use a shorter due diligence period instead of the right to request repairs. Hey, I kind of touched on how defect is a difficult term to kind of nail down and understand. But the biggest issue with this from a seller perspective is that what the form says is when the buyer is sending in the amendment for the seller to correct all the defects, what they have to provide with that amendment is the actual inspection report. Now, as a seller, do you want that inspection report? No, why not?
Because any defect on that inspection, you're aware of it, you have to make it known.
Correct, and it's not even just the defects, it's literally anything in the inspection. Right, and so if the contract falls through, now when you go to relist the property, your seller's property disclosure has to reflect every single thing on that inspection report. Also, what the seller's property disclosure says is that if the seller becomes aware of anything that's incorrect on the disclosure, they have to update it. So even if this contract doesn't fall through, technically, they're obligated to update that disclosure to reflect everything that's on the inspection report, which is annoying for the seller, right? But it's problematic if they're wanting to relist the property because they don't want to correct whatever it is the buyer's asking for.
Ashley, question. If you're using a standard purchase and sale agreement and it has then there the due diligence period, do you not fill that out and does it say C right to repair exhibit? How do you distinguish that on the original offer?
So if you're using that, what you would do is you would write 0 in the due diligence period, because it doesn't make any sense to have due diligence and right to request repairs. It's really an either or scenario. So you just put 0 in there. And then on your exhibits list, you would include right to request repairs as an exhibit.
All right. And the second question, so just coming off of what the last individual said, I've had offers where just recently where they wanted repairs done. And I always, they'll say on page 2, it's got this, and page 3, it's got this problem. So I look at that so I can identify it. And we came to a situation where we could not agree on the price that they wanted after the inspection or something. So I just rejected it. Now typically I want to see that repair list, even if we can't come to agreement on the repairs, but I don't remember going in and having to list everything on that 50-page report.
then honestly, that probably means your seller didn't quite do it correctly. So as the listing agent, you don't want to see that report. And I understand that when you get a request, like I want these 8 things corrected because the inspection report says that there's an issue. I understand you want a confirmation or validation that it really is an issue, but it's sort of a cost benefit analysis, right? The benefit is, you know, that they're telling the truth and that there's an issue, but the cost is that now you know every single issue. And to me, the cost greatly outweighs the benefit. So I wouldn't ask for it and I wouldn't want to see it. If your seller really wants to make sure, they can certainly get a second opinion, but if they see the report, then they have to disclose everything. And I was talking about this, I forget what it was or where it was, I was talking about it. But someone said, how about we just ask for the 1 page where it shows that item that's being corrected? And my thought on that is still the same, because what if, you know, you wanted, there's like 1 piece of rotted wood on the deck. And you want to see that in the inspection report, but what if that same page also says that there's like mold in the refrigerator? Well, now all of a sudden, you know about the mold that you didn't really want to know about before. So I think the same sort of risk exists asking for the 1 page. And the way I would word any sort of an amendment to address concerns or with the right to request repairs, the amendment asking to correct those defects, I would never even reference the inspection report. And really what you want to do is say, who is supposed to do what by when? Give a specific person an action to complete, because the way the inspection reports are written is to list problems. The way your amendments should be written is to create action. 2 different goals there. And the real issue with actually lumping in the inspection to the contract is kind of twofold. So now the entire inspection is incorporated into the contract. So really your seller is saying they've seen it because it's part of the contract, but to the lender for it. Yeah, and so if the lender wants to see the inspection report, now you gotta get the whole report to the lender. You can't just send them the 1 page. And you probably, not that you should ever hide stuff from your lender, that's not what I'm saying, but we maybe don't wanna highlight every issue that could be wrong with their collateral, right? So I would avoid doing that as a listing agent. I would absolutely not want to see the inspection report or any part of it. So instead of like seller to correct the following, rotted wood on deck, per inspection report picture 4-2C, I would say seller to replace rotted wood on deck in corner of like southeast corner, you know, whatever it is, identify it, but just seller to correct whether, or seller to replace the rotted wood. I think that's much cleaner.
All right, another question on that end. Then what I've been doing lately is saying, send me an email first with that information. Don't send me an ATAC until we figure out what we can agree on, and we can look at that report, then write up the ATAC. So I've been doing it that way where I can quickly go to the page and see the photo and so forth, but I never want them to put that in the ATAC. So I do it preliminary. That's okay, right?
No, I still wouldn't do that because you receiving the inspection is the same thing as your client receiving the inspection. So even if you never pass it on to them, if you represent them as a client, then notice to you is notice to the client. So now you know of all these things in the report, therefore your seller knows about all of that. So that part of the issue is the exact same, not putting it in the contract. That only resolves the lender part of it, doesn't resolve the fact that now you and your seller have actual knowledge of all of it. So I would not want to receive the report at all for any reason.
Okay, but just to request to repair something doesn't necessarily mean that's a defect. It just means that that's their cosmetic request, and we're not going to answer a cosmetic request to repaint the kitchen. That's not a defect, right?
Correct.
All right.
Not a defect. So a buyer should not be asking for that if you do not have due diligence and just have right to request repairs.
So that's a question just for not due diligence, and then after due diligence, you mentioned APAC, which that's an amendment to address concern, which goes along with the due diligence,
Correct.
not the right to request repairs.
Correct. Correct, yeah, two separate things, and that's the other thing that's so confusing about the right to request repairs. Is that people don't understand that they're only allowed to ask for defects, they don't understand that there's different forms that go along with that. So they put right to request repairs in the contract, and then they treat it like due diligence. And that's a problem, because it doesn't work like due diligence at all. Much, much different,
So it's better to go with due diligence and
100%.
amendment to address concerns. And then in that, you put it where the seller doesn't address the amendment at a certain point, contract's on void.
Yes, but you can't put it in that amendment to address concerns, it has to be part of the contract.
Part of the
before.
contract, right.
Mhm.
Right. If-
Yeah.
if it's presented,
GAR has a pre-written stipulation that basically says if the seller doesn't accept the amendment to address concerns by the time due diligence ends, the actual amendment to address concerns will serve as notice of termination.
Okay.
So there's a stipulation that says that,
Right.
but
It does
that's
have to
only
be in the
relevant
contract.
if the seller signed off.
right,
Yeah,
got it.
exactly. So conventional loan, I know the financing contingency and appraisal contingencies are kind of hot buttons as far as getting your offer accepted. So when you have a conventional loan, the first thing that you want to do is you want to call the lender. And I would do this with FHA and VA as well. Call the lender to get the number of days that they need as far as your loan contingency and as far as your appraisal contingency goes. You want to make sure that you nail that down, because that's going to be really the first two things that sellers look at is, okay, can they get out because of a loan? Can they get out because of an appraisal? And so if you've got an offer with 12 days financing contingency, 12 days of appraisal, but someone else has 5 and 5, well, that is a lot more attractive to a seller than 12 and 12, right? But you can't just say 5. Why do I say you can't just say 5?
Because you don't know how long the lender is gonna take.
Yeah, it's not that lenders look at the exhibit and say, okay, I have 5 days to get this in, no problem. They, they'll do everything they can, but if the appraiser doesn't give the appraisal back, then there's not a whole lot they can do about it. So calling a lender to say, how long do you need to get this person underwritten? How long do you need to get the appraisal back is a crucial first step. Plus, you want to talk to them anyway to fill out the boxes on the first page so that if you get a loan denial letter, it's usable. So call your lender, get pre-underwritten. There are lots of lenders that offer that, or fast track is what some of them call. There's different phrases they use for that, but the bottom line is they're getting all the underwritten done. All they need is like underwrite the property. So the buyer is good to go. They just need to add the last couple details on whatever property they're gonna buy. That allows you to either waive or make a really short loan contingency on all three of the type of loans that we see a lot. But that crucial first step is talking to the lender and getting that information to make an offer that's as aggressive as possible. On the conventional loan exhibit, there's kind of 2 blanks for days that you fill in, right? It's the loan contingency and it's the appraisal contingency. And I've seen a lot of people put 0 and 0. So no loan, no appraisal. What do we think about doing that?
We think it's awesome.
It depends, Ashley. Sometimes you've talked to your lender and they can get those things done during due diligence, so you don't need the contingencies.
Right, so I'm not talking about waiving both contingencies, I'm talking about using the conventional loan contingency form and putting 0 days for conventional, 0 days for appraisal. So you can waive both, but is that a good way to waive both?
Well, there's another form. But I talked to somebody else, who were nameless, who will still do this, use this exhibit because of the additional information on it and just call it an exhibit, not a contingency. Because a lot of people are familiar with this form more so than the other form that you're going to present to us.
So, yes, and I understand why they're saying that, however, I do not recommend that, and the reason why I say please don't do 0 and 0. Yes, there's some other information on the form, but the only other information that really is usable is that the seller is given authorization to communicate with the lender. You can add that to your contract. Because really a court could look at this and say, okay, this is a contingency exhibit, and it doesn't matter what you call it, it's still an exhibit, and then the actual like title of the exhibit has the word contingency in it.
Right.
And if you're not using either contingency, what's the point of the form? And I think that would be difficult for a court to say why someone would use that form if the point is to have two contingencies and you've waived both. So a court could say that, financing is a material term of the contract. And if there was not a meeting of the minds, because why the heck would you use this if you're not actually using it? That could make the contract work.
But Ashley, question, you have to show in that contingency loan, the amount of money they're putting down. That's something I think I had recently, something like that, where they showed me what they were putting down in their rate. It was a fixed rate, and then they had no contingency because they weren't going to challenge the appraisal.
It's still wrong. So the point of that form is not to disclose to the seller what type of loan you're getting. The point of the form and the point of those boxes to fill in, like what the percentage of the sales price of the loan is gonna be, what the interest rate is, what type of loan, all that stuff. It's not to disclose, it's to say, if I get a loan denial letter with these terms, then I can terminate. But if you're not gonna be able to terminate because there's no contingency, then all of that is useless. It's not relevant to the contract. So you're all correct in that people totally use this form as a disclosure, but it's still incorrect. And so what I would like to see is everyone start using it correctly, right? And there's other ways, instead of doing 0 and 0, to communicate the same thing to people. So I would not recommend doing that. If you really want to use this form, is 1 and 1 really going to be a big difference? No, it's not, because your lender is probably not going to need 1 day to do financing, and the seller 1 day to them is not a huge deal. No appraisal is going to come back in 1 day. So putting 1 and 1 at least makes this form useful if you're just like dead set on using the form. But again, if you're waiving both contingencies, there are better ways to do that.
All right, another question. Why would there be a need to make a difference in the days for the appraisal and the financing? Will they always be the same, like 7 and 7 or 14 and 15?
No, they can be different.
Why? Why would you be different?
Well, because you need different timeframes. Like if you have a lender that says, this person is pre-underwritten, we don't even need the financing contingency, but we don't have the appraisal back, then you might put 0 for financing and 10 for appraisal. Or maybe they say, okay, we haven't pre-underwritten them, but we can do that in a week, but our appraisals are taking 2 weeks to come back. So you would put 7 for financing, and then you put 14 for the appraisal, because your lender told you they needed longer for that item than they did for the financing portion. Because keep in mind that an appraisal coming in low is not a legitimate reason alone on a loan denial letter to terminate under the financing contingency. So you can't.
Say that again. I'm sorry, say that again.
For a loan denial letter, there's a list of things that it cannot be based solely on. And the appraisal coming in low is one of those prohibited reasons, if you will. So
You just have to
you
negotiate. All right.
cannot get out of the contract under the financing contingency because your appraisal comes in low.
Appraisal contingency.
Under the appraisal contingency, you can,
But not
but
under
you
the
cannot
finance.
use the financing
Right.
contingency.
Well, the appraisal comes in low, say 355, comes in at 350, and it's a meeting of the minds. Say, hey, are you gonna lower the price? Or you're not gonna lower the price?
If you have an
If
appraisal
you have an
contingency.
appraisal
If you
contingency,
have
and
an
you're still
contingency,
within
yeah.
that time frame.
In that
Yes.
time, okay.
So, but what you can't, what some people were trying to do is say, well, we'll waive the appraisal contingency because we know that the lender is gonna deny the loan because we can't afford to cover the gap. And so we'll just have the loan denial letter say that the appraisal came in low. You can't do that.
Okay.
So you can't conflate the two contingencies.
All right.
And then, go
I
ahead.
apologize. So if it comes in at 350, 355 is the asking price. And, you can't agree on the other $5,000. Is it terminated?
No, the buyer has to actually terminate the
The buyer
contract.
has to terminate. Okay, notice to terminate.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so you send in the amendment to change the sale. Now, this is only for the conventional.
Right.
So you send in the amendment as long as you're within that appraisal contingency. The seller then has a certain number of days to respond. If they don't, the buyer's got a certain number of days to terminate.
Okay,
And if they don't, then it's deemed waived and they're covering the gap.
okay.
The other thing I wanted to point out, if you have a condo property, please use this stipulation. It's a pre-written GAR special stip. You want to use this, help your lender out. And this is also going to help make your offer more attractive, because if you have a condo, you're going to want to put a longer financing contingency to make sure that the lender can approve the condo. But instead of doing a longer loan contingency, you can keep that short loan contingency and just use this stipulation, make that longer. That way the seller understands, hey, we're not worried that my buyer's not gonna be good to go. We're only worried about the condo, which is really, your seller's problem, because that condo is gonna be your seller's condo no matter what, right? So you're gonna wanna know if it's approved or not. So let's go ahead and put a longer time frame in here, but that allows you to keep the shorter time frames for your loan contingency. So it narrows why the buyer can terminate. Okay?
Question. So I tried to go into the GAR forms and find that stipulation SS 528 and I could not find it. How do we find these stipulations for a cut and paste?
So I don't know how it looks on your end. On my end, I get like, for training purposes only PDFs of all the forms, and one of the PDFs is all of the special stipulations. I think when y'all log in to look at your forms, there should be, you're gonna click on it like it's a form, and it's a list of all the special stipulations.
Right.
Now, how that works as far as like DocuSign and like cutting and pasting and all that, I don't know the answer to that. Tyler or maybe Lucy may know how to do that. But there is a pre-written list of them that you do have access to.
Yeah, well, I found the list, but it didn't, it just told you what they were. It didn't have the stip. So I didn't know how to find that. All right, thanks.
I don't know, I'm not your girl for the logistics of how that works. So for the no financing contingency form, when y'all should be using this is when your buyer's pre-underwritten, so you don't need the financing contingency. Or if your buyer wants to buy with a loan, but they can still buy with cash if the loan falls through, so you don't really care if it's contingent or not. If you've got a hard money lender, this is the form that you're gonna use, because you can't really have a loan contingency based off of a hard money lender, just because their requirements and underwriting, there's not really the same standard that the institutional lender has. So they could pull it at any time. So making it contingent on the hard money lender is really not a feasible activity. And of course, if you have a cash buyer, then this is the perfect form to use. You can also just use it when you want to waive the financing contingency, right? Because your buyer's pre-underwritten. So this is a great way to make your offer more attractive than using the conventional. This is much better than putting 0 and 0, right? You can still have an appraisal contingency in this form. They have that, but you don't have to use it. It's optional. This is great because we're gonna avoid the bait and switch, which was a huge issue before they updated the form. And that's something that you absolutely don't want to do. Sending in an offer is presenting it like you're doing one thing, all the while knowing you're doing something else. Be open and honest again from that reputation perspective. You don't want to be known as the agent who puts in a sneaky offer just to do something else. So this form is helpful in making it clear from the get-go what your buyer actually intends to do. So kind of.
How does the bait and switch work?
You what?
How does the bait and switch work?
So what people were doing is saying they were buying the property cash and then retaining the right to get a loan, knowing all the while they were always gonna get a loan. They were never gonna buy it cash. And so it looked like a cash offer. And so that's kind of why they updated the form. It's gonna be a little bit harder to do with this form.
So that's what this company's out of business, because I know there are several companies that will go on, like say, we can make it like a cash offer to make it look stronger to the stuff.
That's not about the bait and switch.
Yes, okay.
There's several companies that do that. There's different addendums, and that's not pretending to do something. I'm talking about like Ashley Connor is buying the house, and I'm gonna say, I'm buying it cash, and then I'm, have the right to get a loan. So the seller thinks, ooh, a cash offer. But what I really meant was, I want you to accept my offer, so I'm gonna pretend like it's cash, but I've been talking to this lender since last month, and they're for sure gonna give me a loan on the property.
Okay,
But like Ribbon and Home Start and all those kind of things, that's not deceptive.
okay.
That's fine, because their addendums will say, like, really, we will buy it cash if the buyer can't get a loan, and that's all part of the contract. So I wouldn't worry about that. So kind of ranking ways to waive the financing contingency, 0 and 0 really renders the form useless. Let's not do that. 0 and then number of days for the appraisal contingency, if you're using the conventional form, that's fine, because you're using one of the two contingencies, and you can do it the other way too, right? You can put the financing contingency and then waive appraisal, and that works as well. The best thing to do is use that exhibit. Now, the other creative thing you can do, because we're gonna talk to our lender and figure out how much time they need, and let's say they need, 5 days for financing, 8 days for appraisal. Maybe just give yourself 9 or 10 days of due diligence and not use any sort of financing form at all. That way, because remember due diligence, you can terminate for any reason whatsoever. So if you can wrap it all up in due diligence, you don't need any of these forms, because you can terminate for any reason.
So in this market, not so big. It's, that when you say 10 days.
It really just depends. So you wanna read the private remarks, what a lot of listing agents are doing is they're saying, this is what matters to the seller. If they're not, I would definitely call them and say what matters.
Okay.
And so the conversation says they really, really want a short due diligence period. They're not worried about financing. They know the house is gonna appraise. They just don't want a long due diligence period. Then I wouldn't do that. I would use the financing. But if they say, our seller does not want to see a financing contingency, they do not want to see an appraisal contingency, and they want to stay in the house for 10 days after closing, then, okay, I'll do a long due diligence, because now I'm complying with what you asked, while still protecting my client. Now, they might counter back with a lower due diligence timeframe, and then that's a discussion to go back to your lender, to have with your buyer, assess the risk, but kind of out the gate, I would ask what's important, or figure out what's important, and then there's an option on how to craft the offer to protect your client and also satisfy what the seller wants. As far as things in the contract that are good to have kind of from the get-go. Earnest money. Couple things on that. Obviously, the higher the earnest money, the more attractive that's gonna be. It's gonna show that the buyer is more serious. I think 1% is traditionally what amount goes there on average. I think the more attractive you want to make the offer, it's significantly higher. So obviously discussion to have with your buyer to go over the risk, but using that as a tool, I think is underrated. High earnest money goes a long way. And also you want to pick the wire transfer. That's more attractive to a seller because as soon as the holder receives it, it's usable funds. There's no chance of it bouncing. An ACH or a check can both bounce. So you might say earnest money is turned in a day, but it takes 10 days to clear. Now, all of a sudden on day 9, you learn that the check bounced, you don't actually have earnest money. That's never gonna happen with a wire. Once you receive the wire, it's legitimate, real money, they can't take it back. So that is what you're gonna wanna see. Also, the shortest time frame that you can put in that box is gonna be the best. That's what's gonna be most advantageous to a seller. So I would not say 3 days, right? If you can say, here's, within 1 day of binding agreement date, so we'll wire it tomorrow if you accept our offer, right? If you're doing it over the weekend, keep that in mind. Maybe you don't choose wire, because if you're sending it Friday, saying, I'll turn in earnest money in 1 day, you can't really wire something on Saturday, in most cases. So think about that when you're putting your offer together, but as a general rule, the higher the earnest money, make it a wire, make it due as quickly as possible.
What about that, online thing, the earnest,
That's an ACH transfer.
or safety transfer?
Yeah, and we have a portal as well. It works the same kind of way, but those are ACHs, so you can still claw them back. Now, they're great for weekend use, right? So if you're doing a contract, you're sending it in on Friday, maybe you check the ACH and the wire box. That way they can do either or, and if they're sending it Saturday, they can go ahead and send it on the portal, or you make it 3 days for them to send on Monday. So just thinking through the timing and how you're gonna be able to do it, but
So
to the extent you can.
if you do it on Friday evening, say 5 o'clock, It's every day but Sunday counts, right, towards the days.
Every day counts.
Every day counts, okay? Oh,
Yeah, most things in the contract are calendar days.
count.
One exception is if earnest money is not turned in and the holder gives notice that it's not turned in,
Okay,
then the buyer's got 3 banking days.
Okay.
To cure the default. But as far as turning earnest money in is days, the Saturday and Sunday. Option money. This is a great tool that I think is really underutilized in a seller's market. This can be very attractive for a seller. So, like I said earlier, due diligence is an option contract. What option money is it's this, the buyer is giving the seller money, so they're purchasing the right to have a pre-look at the property. They're purchasing the right to terminate for any reason whatsoever. So you're gonna fill in, you got your due diligence period, and then you're gonna fill in the option money. Typically, I see stuff like 1,000, 1,500, but you can make it as high as you want. Know that this goes directly to the seller, so it's great for a seller because it's money in their pocket from the get-go. It's not earnest money held by a holder. It goes directly to the seller. And the only reason a buyer would get this back is if the seller breaches the contract. So when you frame it to your buyer, frame it like you're never gonna see this money again, period, end of story, don't expect to see it back. Because if the seller breaches the contract, what are the chances they're gonna voluntarily give that money back? Close to 0, right? You'd have to sue them, and you're not gonna sue someone for $1,000. So frame it to your buyer, like you'll never see this money again. But for the seller, it's awesome, because what if they need a little bit of cash? You know, maybe you end up asking them to paint the dining room because it looks terrible. Well, now they have your $1,000 that they can use towards, doing that repair. Or maybe they're looking to move and they need just a little bit more earnest money. Now they have this $1,000 that they actually get, or whatever amount you want to use. Obviously, the more expensive the property, the higher everything ends up being. But this is an awesome tool that literally nobody uses. Be careful.
Ashley. Hey, how are you? This is Juan. I do have a question about that. Do you, when you give, let's say, $1,000, do you also give them a 1099 for that?
Technically, you could ask for that. I don't know that that's commonplace to do that, but you could ask for it. But I don't know that you have to, and honestly, I don't know that I've seen anyone do it, but I don't think it's wrong to ask for it.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. But what I do want y'all to be careful about is y'all see these boxes in number 2, where it says shall or shall not be applied to closing. Shall be applied means it's gonna show up on the settlement statement like earnest money. The buyer's gonna get credit, but also the seller is gonna get debited for that. They've already received that $1,000, so they're not gonna receive it again.
Right.
If you put shall not be applied at closing, what that means is you're not gonna see it on the settlement statement at all. It is over and above whatever the purchase price is. So as a buyer, you want it to be applied to closing. I would always check that when I'm sending an auction money. But as a listing agent, if it's really competitive, I might say, let's change that to shall not, so it's over and above. So be careful on that and make sure you're explaining that to your clients correctly.
I think that's a good question as far as 1099 is concerned,
Yeah,
because you have money changing hands,
correct.
right?
Yeah.
It's outside of we're kind of outside the house buying process, not in the closing statement, so.
If it is on the closing statement, you pick shall. It's
No, I'm not, but you put shall not,
Shall
but
not.
just the shall not side of it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I definitely don't think it's wrong to ask for the 1099. As far as whether it's required, I think that's a good question for an accountant. And since I'm not a licensed accountant, that's not part of the transaction necessarily. And again, I don't really see that being done, but again, most of the time I see shall be applied at closing.
Yeah.
So you
I mean,
could run
shall
that by
not,
an
it's
accountant.
income.
It's definitely.
Can you go over that again, the distinction and why one is better than the other? Is just an accounting factor or?
No, it's not that one is better for the other, one is better for the buyer, one is better for the seller. So to say shall be applied at closing, that means, let's say you have a $300,000 house. If the buyer gives the seller $1,000 of option money and you said it shall be applied, the buyer only owes the seller $299,000, right? Because they've already given them $1,000. If you say shall not be applied, that means it's over and above. So the buyer's already given them 1,000, but they still owe them the full 300,000 because it's not applied at closing. So it really changes the total amount of money the seller gets.
So they get it regardless, but if they take the deal and it goes through, you just take it off of the closing cost. Or take it off.
If you pick Shatter.
Ah, okay, I got you. All right.
And they don't get it regardless, they only get it if the contract goes binding, but as soon as
Right.
it goes binding, that obligation exists, yeah.
Well, okay. I thought the option money was, they got it only if it goes binding, huh? All right, yes. But then if you due diligence terminate, they get to keep it, so it stays there, right? Yeah.
Yep. And then just real quick, obviously, seller credit, the lower the credit, the more attractive the offer is gonna be. The more you ask the seller to pay, the less attractive that will be. And I'll go, I know we're a couple minutes over, so I'll super speed through these and I can send out a copy of the PowerPoint to anybody that wants it. Escalation, yeah, of course.
Great.
Escalation clauses, they are fine to use if you know how to use them. I would avoid using them if there's like 30 offers on the property. Again, this is a try to make the listing agent happy kind of pointer. If you're the listing agent and you have 30 offers that are all escalating over each other, that is super confusing for you. That is super confusing for your client. But if you think there's gonna be like 5 offers, the escalation clause can be helpful then. So an escalation clause says, we agree to pay X amount of dollars over the highest offer that you get. That way it bumps you up to the biggest price. So there are good reasons to use them, but if there's a gazillion offers, I think that is very overwhelming for a listing agent, and I probably would avoid that at that point in time. So here is the language I would recommend using. You can do it with a cap, or you can do it without a cap. I would only ever use the without a cap if you have due diligence. If you don't have due diligence, do not use that. Okay, you've got a $400,000 house and you say, okay, we'll pay, $5,002 over the next highest offer. Your buyer's willing to pay, or what I said, $500,000 house, your buyer's willing to pay $520,000. Well, what if someone else is willing to pay $625 and they come in at $620 and you've escalated your buyer now to $625? They're like, whoa, I can't afford that at all. If you don't have due diligence, they're stuck and they're losing that earnest money because they can't afford it. But if you do have due diligence, they come back saying, we accept your offer. Here's the next highest offer. Your sale price is now $625,002. Then if you have due diligence, terminate. No harm, no foul. So use that. What's important about this is that it talks about the net proceeds to the seller. Because if you have a $500,000 sales price and you come in at $500,000 and $0 seller credit, but let's say I come in at $505 and a $10,000 seller credit, now my net is actually lower than yours, but if you just reference sales price, my sales price is higher. So it's gonna jack yours up more than really makes sense. So use net proceeds and be careful with that. The other thing that I'll say is as far as the amount that you're filling in on that blank, use a sort of off amount, right? Like I said, $5,002, because a lot of people are gonna use even numbers. So if you have 3 people that have said $5,000, well, they're all the exact same. But if you said 5,002, that's really, nobody cares between the difference between 5,000 and 5,002, but now all of a sudden you are the highest one. Right, so add like another $100 or $6, or whatever it is, make it a not perfectly round number, just to give you a little bit of a leg up there. As far as appraisal gap stipulations, if you have an FHA or VA loan, can't use them. A mandatory clause wins out, period, end of story. You can use them to show intent, but there's no teeth to it. So if you represent a buyer and the listing agent says, hey, we need to see a gap stipulation, I think it's ethical for you to say, we can write it, but it doesn't actually hold any weight, right? and have that conversation, so you're not that agent that pulls the rug out. And that other agent, if they didn't know that, they'll really appreciate that you told them that, and they'll appreciate that you taught them something and didn't take advantage of them. So when they see your name again, they'll be really interested in working with you. So know that is not how it works. For conventional or the no financing exhibit, you want to make sure you've got a ceiling, so the sales price, you want to make sure you have a floor. So an amount that if it goes lower than that, then you have some sort of action to do. Because if you say we'll cover $10,000 and it's, you know, a $500,000 house, everyone's anticipating it coming in at $490 and still getting the full $5. What if it comes in at $350? Is it fair for the seller to accept $360 for it, and what they wanted was $500? No, you need some sort of mechanism to
Well,
renegotiate.
for you buyer to buy it all of a sudden. Maybe they want to buy in a $100,000 neighborhood and not a $350 neighborhood.
Right, and they're like, well, what's wrong with this house? It's
Right.
only worth it, I don't want it. So you don't want to kind of lock parties into something that really doesn't make sense. So that's why I say have a floor and actually reference that appraisal contingency that you already have in your contract. Because this only makes sense if you have the conventional or the no financing that has the appraisal contingency. Because the third thing to remember that people do that I see done incorrectly a bunch is you don't actually have an appraisal contingency unless you add an appraisal contingency into the contract, right? So you don't have it at all. Then what your buyer is saying is they're gonna cover the gap, period, and it's short. You don't need a stipulation. So some agents are like, I wanna see a gap stip, but it's silly because there is no appraisal contingency to even necessitate a gap coverage. So think through these things when you're getting asked them, don't just say, no problem, I'll add it in. And you know, if that's gonna be a sticking point, you can add it, but then you also have to add an appraisal contingency, which ends up hurting the seller. So no, I would try to educate the other side in using that. Here's the language. I won't read this to you because like I said, I'm happy to send out copies of this. But the other thing you want to do is to make it really attractive, add in a proof of funds to your stipulation. Because nobody cares if you want to pay the $30,000 gap if you don't actually have the $30,000 to pay the gap, right? So I think that really, really strengthens it because it not only says I'm willing to pay it, but I can pay it and I'm happy to prove it to you. I want you to know I'm serious about paying that gap. That packs a big punch. So I would absolutely add that in there. If it's for a conventional loan, I would just borrow the language from the no financing contingency exhibit as far as the verification of funds goes. You're gonna have to doctor it a little bit because you don't need to source buyer funds necessary to purchase the property. You need to source buyer funds necessary to cover the gap. But other than a little bit of word doctoring, I would by and large borrow that. If you're doing the no financing contingency form, then you can just actually reference those paragraphs in that form because they're part of your contract. But again, you're adding in that proof of funds language. Unique touches, real quick, I think this is also really important, especially when there's tons and tons of offers coming in. A couple things that I've seen done well is you go to view the property, you walk around, you see the sellers have this really extensive burden bar. So after you view the property, you leave them a little gift. Thank you so much for letting me tour your home. It was beautiful. You leave like a little bottle of bourbon, whatever. Then in your contract, one of your stipulations is upon closing, buyer to give seller a case of whatever bourbon it was that they really liked. So that does two things. One, or multiple things. One, it reminds them, oh, these are the people that gave me that gift. How nice. Almost the same sort of thing as a love letter does without actually bringing up any sort of discrimination, anything, right? It also says, hey, this is unique, this stands out, and I'm gonna remember this offer. And third, they love bourbon, they're excited about it. They already have a good feeling with the offer. So I had a closing where that was done. There was another closing where people walked to the house and next to the Keurig, there was one type of Keurig box. So after they viewed the property, they left a box of those same Keurig pods. Thank you so much for letting me view your beautiful home. Then in the contract, they transferred a case of those coffee pods. So it links up, gives the good vibes, makes it memorable. And the same thing done with Girl Scout cookies. Or like, you walk through my house, you're like, oh, that girl loves Alabama. I'm gonna leave you like a jersey, something, little things like that create a really, really good feeling, same as the love letter. But almost more so, because what you're doing, people love to talk about themselves. And so it gives them an opportunity to say, hey, that person saw me. They noticed something about me. I really like that. So that's a little unique touch that can really make your offer stand out. Obviously, the other terms still have to be good. It's got to be a strong offer. But when you've got 5 strong offers, something like this can really tip you over the edge.
All right, let me understand this. You're saying if you see that they have Girl Scout cookies, you leave them some Girl Scout cookies, or you leave them a small bottle of bourbon. How would you know if you didn't go back there and leave it a second time?
You have to go back there and leave it. You have
So
to
you
make
go-
the effort to go back. You just leave it on their doorstep. You don't have
Oh,
to. leave it
I
in
see.
your box. You don't want to go
Okay.
back.
You're not like a- So you have
Okay,
to-
in fact, you know that you leave later, not during the showing. All right.
Yeah. Now, if you know and want to leave it during the showing, I mean, you can. It's up to you. There's not really like standards for that. It's just trying to make it memorable, giving them something, then connecting you to that gift while also saying, I noticed something about you, and that's gonna stand out.
I feel like there might be a way to be able to take that still to court and challenge it because you're discriminating against somebody.
Huh.
Maybe they're into running. And you leave them
Yeah.
something that had to do with running. And
Well-
that's discriminatory against non-ambulatory people.
I mean, honestly, if you leave them shoes, people in wheelchairs still wear shoes. So I don't know. I think you'd be able to get around all of those. I'm less worried about it.
Okay,
Again, this is speaking to the seller and what you know about the seller,
Right.
not offering something about the buyer. Because just because you like to run as a seller, maybe I am in a wheelchair and I don't run, but I'm so happy that you like to run and I'm just trying to make you happy. So I think that's the difference, is it's speaking to the seller and not the buyer. Not necessarily saying, I also love to run.
yeah.
I thought you liked to run. And then real quick, backup offers, always do a backup offer. It's great for buyers because you're locked in if the first one falls through. It's great for sellers because you don't have to go back on the market. So if you don't, now, you don't want to send in your offer being a backup, you want to try to be the primary, right? But if they say, hey, we accepted someone else, say, can I be a backup? It's great for both sides to do that. And we talked about being nice. All right, I know we ran a little bit over, but I appreciate you guys. Y'all have any questions for me?
Can you please send the slides?
Yeah, let me see if I can, before people.
Is there a handout? It's really hard to just read it. Is there a special form for the backup offer, or you're just putting another backup? You just put
No, there's a special,
There's a special form for it.
Like a different class altogether.
yeah, it's 604 and 605. Okay, so I don't know how to save the chat, but if you want to shoot me an email, I'll respond and send you the PowerPoint.
Right, PowerPoint, okay.
Can you shoot me a copy? Well,
I'll try to write down who was on the Zoom.
Hey, Connor. Right, so you're already gonna.
I will send it to everyone that I see here. So you're obviously here. I will send it out to everyone I got down, but if you don't get it from me, let me know and I'm happy to send it, but y'all here also.
Thank you, Ashley.
All right, well, thanks again. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ashley.
Ashley.
Welcome.
Diane. Nobody. What happened? Well, I think okay. Okay, pero no sé qué está, bajo el dedo del diante, me podía. Sí, well, she just, you know, it's just listed for sure, for hand. Pero como ven, no. Oigan, yo, pero entiendo,